is Pete Saronis, and I am super honored and excited to host today's episode of Industry Insights with our esteemed guests, Mr. John Yaldwin, Jitendra Vora, and AJ Grewal. We're going to talk about a topic that may seem complex, but really, hopefully, by the time we're done, is pretty crystal clear in terms of its importance to our nation's critical infrastructure, the devices we use, the integration needed, and the role that private LTE, spectrum, standards, certification, all must play in order to, from the customer and the consumer standpoint, present an incredible experience that is resilient, secure, and flexible. Our title is FCC Certified Devices Panel for the Utility Grid Evolution that is underway. And a little bit about me really quickly is I'm Pete Saronis. I worked at the United States Department of Energy, as well as the Department of Education, as well as the Department of Defense during my 25-year run. My company is Dots and Bridges, and I don't sell anything, but I serve as like a connective tissue, I hope, to industry, academia, and government to articulate, illustrate, and share these brilliant individuals today and others who are helping move that needle towards a safer, secure life for us, a societal and economic value proposition, and how technology, critical infrastructure, and our cities and communities become smarter and safer. So with that, I also want to give a huge shout out to the Anterix family and their exciting news from yesterday, May 10th, regarding, 2 days ago, forgive me, the Active Ecosystem program that was launched. This is an incredible consortium of collaborators. These three gentlemen and their companies are charter members. We're going to be hoping that this, or they are going to be hoping that this community of interest, this community of practice brings together the stakeholders to serve a greater good, which is a lot of what we've already talked about. But everything from their Anterix Active badging capability or to be continued and learn more about, go to Anterix.com and you can find a ton of information there. And for anybody who doesn't know who Anterix is, they are the largest holder of licensed spectrum in the 900 megahertz band, and they have nationwide coverage throughout the United States, Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico. And they got an incredible group of leaders from Deanne Campbell to Gina Ash to Ryan Gerbrandt, Chris Gutman McCabe, Rob Schwartz, Morgan O'Brien, and so many others. So I'm very, very fortunate to participate today. With that, John Yaldwin, I can say this, and I'm going to have you fill in a bit of the gaps, as well as my colleagues, both AJ and Jitendra. John Yaldwin's the CTO and founder of 4RF. This gentleman knows how to triage this radio communications policy and security discussion. You're going to hear more about that throughout, and very honored to know this gentleman. AJ Grewal, the senior systems architect at GE MDS, and I'll let AJ explain what the MDS is all about, but electrical engineer, really conversant in the transportation sector and industrial communication. So it's going to be, he helps geek out with us and explain what it all means. So I'm excited to have AJ here as well. And then Jitendra, who is Notre Dame University of Illinois grad. I like to call Notre Dame the Villanova of the Midwest, being a Villanova guy, but that's an inside joke the two of us had. Electrical engineer and MBA, rich history or experiences in private LTE, the safety of those devices, and to hear Jitendra's view as it relates to technology road mapping. He's the director of product marketing and carrier relations at Telit. So there we go. We laid it out. John, I'm going to come right back to you and to each of you as we discussed. Talk a little bit at the outset of what you hope to convey, your passion for this space, and what you think is sort of that hidden in plain view but needs to be emphasized part of the conversation.
Well, thanks Pete. Thanks for the introduction. The Anterix spectrum is a real opportunity for utilities. For quite some time now, utilities and other critical infrastructure players in the United States and indeed in other countries around the world have struggled to find adequate spectrum to address their broadband needs. And the initiative by Anterix resulted in a restructuring plan and a FCC report and order last year, which was really quite a landmark. It has freed up a total of 6 megahertz of very valuable 900 megahertz spectrum, 3 megs up, 3 megs down, needed for broadband services, which will be principally LTE based, that can be used by critical infrastructure operators and for business critical services to provide much needed connectivity. And I want to distinguish here between private LTE and public carriers, because while public carriers provide a fantastic service to the nation, public carriers are focused on the demands of their customers, and most of their customers are iPhone toting consumers of content. So they want to, watch videos, they want to participate in connectivity with their friends, and the priority for the cellular carrier is to keep that service going. It's not the same priority as a utility operator. And in fact, utility customers are very small beer for a major public carrier. And so that's why utility operators want to control their own communications destiny.
John, for framing the way you just did, shout out. The word resilience is very popular in this discussion. Resilience, not just reliability. We're seeing today with on the news throughout the world, maybe you're hearing about it, the Colonial Pipeline discussion is just another instance where our infrastructure is at risk and we have to address that security challenge, which I know so eloquently you stated and care about, and that's physical, cyber, network, however you call it, all falls under the umbrella of security. So thank you for that and for bringing it up and emphasizing private LTE. Jitender, let's go down to you and talk. Same question, passion and what you're most excited about for this conversation.
All right, thank you, Pete. First of all, I've been very excited to be part of this panel with you and my new friends from 4RF and GE. So special thanks to you, Pete, and Anterix for this opportunity. A bit about me, I've always thrived in a fast-paced environment where there's constant change and transition to new technologies such as what we have today, especially when it impacts people's lives. I've been in the wireless space for over 28 years. Previously, I worked at Motorola and then Panasonic, and now I've been with Telit for about 2 years. Most of my experience has been on the infrastructure side of the business, selling solutions to critical infrastructure projects geared towards public safety, private LTE. And now for the past few years, I've been on the devices and module side. This is one of the reasons I love working at Telit in a product marketing role, because I can see the entire solution happening. For those of you that don't really know about Telit, let me just touch upon a couple things and the role that Telit plays in the device ecosystem. We're a global player. We're headquartered in Italy and have a large presence in Israel. We sell a wide portfolio of modules from 2G all the way to 5G that go into devices. We also offer solutions for connectivity, solutions for platforms, and lastly, solutions for application enablement. Now, from a module perspective, Telit has a long history working on private network projects within the utilities globally. We have been supporting private cellular deployments for utilities since the early days of 450 megahertz, roughly since 2015. I'm very excited and confident that new cellular technology, together with private networks, can really satisfy the requirements from the industry that we're talking about today. And most importantly, I truly care for this as it directly impacts the security of our country's critical infrastructure. So today I'll be touching upon things like why is FCC very important and how is Telit meeting the needs of the new requirements. Topics such as that we'll be covering during the course of this webinar.
Well, thank you, and for giving a shout out to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. I just want to emphasize for our audience that we will use probably a good bit of acronyms. We will do our best to explain the acronyms. Sometimes the acronyms simpler to understand than the actual words themselves. But Spectrum, folks, is arguably the most critical infrastructure in the discussion. It is what allows us to communicate, to send email, to talk on phones, to use Wi-Fi in your home. And as John pointed out, specifically, we'll be touching on 900 megahertz for a very good reason, particularly as it relates to the utility sector. AJ, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. Really honored to be on this panel. I'm really passionate about wireless communications, across all the layers of OSI protocol stack. I started my career, developing 2.5G GPRS protocol stack in early 2000s. LTE, 4G LTE, and by extension 5G is like decades of wireless research, codified into a system standard that has been proven to work in the field. And at GE Microwave Data Systems, the wireless group within industrial communications, we're really excited about, bringing this powerful technology in form of, industrial grade routers, devices, and services to help utilities, connect, monitor, and control their field assets to deliver, power to the consumers, in efficient, reliable, and a sustainable way. A little bit about MDS. MDS has been in industrial communications business for about 3 decades. We have been serving the utility industry for about 2 decades now. And for most part of our history, we were focused on our main product line was our proprietary radios, operating in licensed and unlicensed narrowband channels. But about a decade ago, we noticed a trend where the public LTE networks had matured enough to the point where utilities, wanted to set up private APN on those public networks and connect some of their distribution automation assets. So to meet that need, we came up with our Orbit industrial grade router, which now forms our foundation for both our proprietary as well as our cellular products. And I think what Anterix has done, one challenge with LTE has been that the availability of spectrum. LTE requires a certain minimum bandwidth to operate, and the spectrum has been hard to come by. So I think it's quite commendable, what Anterix has done in making available a significant chunk of bandwidth allocation, a 3x3 megahertz allocation, and also in low band, which will really enable utilities to deploy these private 4G LTE networks and converge a lot of their applications onto the single fabric.
Wow, that was a lot that we can unpack, and I tracked it. I love that you mentioned OSI. I'm a big believer in the stack and the 7 layers. So AJ, kindred spirit here. I'm going to bring it back to John and we'll probably go in this flow, and I'm going to encourage my guests here to riff off or comment or tell me to shut up for a minute and just have something to say. This is a conversation, folks. Again, we're hoping that we will educate, enlighten, and inform. The term smart grid is popular. The power grid in our country is, and most countries, what fuels a lot of the other sectors, pun intended. But words like stability, flexibility, sustainability, reliability, you mentioned interoperability, paramount. John, bringing it back to this importance to get this conversation rolling on certification, standards. I live 2 miles from NIST, the National Institutes of Standard and Technology. Please help me explain or go ahead and stress that importance and why it will be the ultimate reason we get to one of these smart grids someday.
Okay, well, you've actually raised a couple of different points there. Let's talk very quickly about the smart grid, because this is an overarching title for a bunch of different applications within the electricity grid in particular. So if you look at the distribution grid, which is where most of the demand for private LTE service comes from, it's characterized by a bunch of devices. And I don't want to get too technical here, but the electricity providers have to provide a network that relies upon devices such as sectionalizers, switches, which open and close and control the flow of electricity. They need to adjust for the varying load on the network with capacitor banks for volt VAR compensation. They have devices such as reclosers and transformers, metering devices. There's a whole raft of equipment within the grid that falls under the smart grid title. And each of these devices has a different demand in terms of latency, in other words, how long it takes the signal to propagate out to them, and capacity. And we need to characterize those, understand them, and fit them all within the smart grid thing. But we won't spend too much time talking about that, but just to be aware that it's not one size fits all. There's a variety of different products. And as AJ touched on, there's private radio solutions, there's unlicensed, there's licensed, and of course today there's LTE, and LTE is certainly the answer to a lot of these problems, because it's so useful to address the different types of communication requirements that these devices have. Now let's just flip over to certification, because this is a good point, and Jitender is probably going to want to talk a little bit about this as well, because it's very important for the radio part of the cellular infrastructure. So the Anterix spectrum was originally Part 90 spectrum, and it's been reclassified as Part 27, FCC Part 27, where the Commission characterises as a miscellaneous wireless service. So under Part 27 rules, when certifying a device, you've got to check things like the transmitter output power, occupied bandwidth, spurious emissions, etc. So that's kind of the first tranche of tests that need to be done for a device to operate on Anterix spectrum. The second part which is required is public safety. That's RF exposure. The Commission's rules, Part 1, 1310, covers the exposure to the general public from transmitting devices. And so there's compliance work that needs to be done there. And in particular, and this is quite exciting for utilities, because of the high power that is allowed for devices in the Anterix spectrum, there needs to be special tests done to make sure that the high power user equipment devices, the things that manufacturers such as GE and 4RF produce, are safe for the general public. So that's the second tranche of test regime that needs to be done for certification. And then finally, there's some additional testing, which is functional network testing, and in particular, network assigned duplex operation, which is unique to the Anterix spectrum, and that needs to be signed off as well. So there are these three components which go to make up device certification for operation on Anterix spectrum, and once that's done, then the manufacturer can proudly wear the Anterix Active badge, which is more than just a marketing term. It's a description which summarizes for our utility audience the fact that this device is approved to operate successfully on LTE networks that will be put up in the Anterix Band 8 spectrum.
Yeah, it totally, thank you for that breakdown, and we will take each of those and speak throughout, because folks tend to gloss over things like policy and why standards matter. I know they're important, but you just very eloquently articulated the importance of there's many standards and there's many certifications. But hey folks, back in the day, I liked when I had a PC or a machine or a server that said Intel inside. The sticker said a lot, and I think the Anterix Active badge could be something that makes us feel pretty good about what we're using and how we're communicating. So thank you, John, for that. Yeah, let's go to Jitender. Jitender, you heard this, certs and standards, products that are being sold. How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, thank you, Pete. Yeah, I think it resonates really well. So I think let me start off by saying FCC certification on Anterix's Band 8, it's a requirement. Otherwise, you need an experimental license for trials and pilots. I also want to say FCC module certification is something we support on all of our modules, really due to three reasons. First of all, it's crucial in the mission critical space where there is zero tolerance for failures, regardless of the size or unacceptable, particularly if it is caused by any device that is operating within IoT technology. Now, the second thing, we realized by us doing FCC certification from a module perspective, it makes things easier for a device OEM such as 4RF or even GE when it comes to their end device FCC certification. So if the device OEM uses a module that is already FCC certified, that will reduce the device manufacturer's effort. And the third thing is we believe in supporting anything that improves resiliency and hardness against cyber attacks. Based upon all this, I mean, the good news is we've completed FCC certification on a couple of our products on Anterix's band. And basically, the band that just got allocated, as John mentioned last year, we also have a line of products that are also going to be certified over the next few weeks.
Well, that again builds on this cert standards. Products must, if they maintain that standard and certification, we get to interoperability. And I think this is part of what I imagine your world is, Jitender, is not to gloss over that, right? You're telling folks, look, the products we sell, the products we buy have been vetted, have been tested, and they work, and you should care. I always joke with my world that I come from where it was, oh, can't I just go get that at Best Buy? And I'm like, and plug it in. You want to be careful when it comes to the utility sector if you think that a smart meter is just something you can go pick up. But having that that standard and certification. You obviously stress that importance. And let me move to AJ here. You know, AJ, when I think of the OSI and security, because I think that's going to be where, I know that's where we're going to take our next question, especially to John. Security, not just cyber, not just physical, not just network. Security is built into an architecture and a stack when products are built, when networks are deployed. Can you talk a little bit about this evolution of why security, and it's not just about cyber, is so significant to the utility communication sector?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, just quick points on the certification. You know, we're really proud that, you know, our Orbit router device was the first one to get the FCC certification for Enterix band and the coveted Enterix active, you know, badge. And, you know, John and Jitendra made all the right points about, you know, it's critical for devices, you know, to get this certification in order to, you know, actually operate, you know, in the field. You know, when it comes to security, you know, our Orbit router platform, you know, was built right from the security, you know, from the get-go. And we classify security, you know, as John had mentioned, you know, both in terms of physical security of the device, you know, whether it's tamper resistance, you know, secure boot, making sure nobody can run just any willy-nilly firmware on the device, that the firmware the device that runs is properly signed by our manufacturing. And, you know, our Orbit router also allows customer to sign the firmware themselves. And then again, the communications protocol security, you know, whether that's the 3GPP security over the LTE air interface, or layering security, you know, on top of that using, you know, IPsec VPNs, and, you know, controlling access, the management access to the device through role-based authentication. So only the authorized people, you know, with the right role are able to manage the devices, and only the right devices are able to connect to the network and go about doing their application communication.
Yeah, you hit on some really popular terms in the IT world that is converging with the OT world, the information technology, or the internet, as like some people like to refer to it, but the operational technology, the SCADA, the industrial control systems, they have a different language. And you know, John, as I come back to you again, it does speak to certs and standards and the like, and you know, the promise of broadband and private LTE. Can you continue that discussion with some things that maybe you can help share with a utility who is still trying to figure out this convergence, and why securing communications, be it with private LTE or your products, is so important if you're really hoping to have one of those networks that's truly resilient?
Good point. I think after safety, security really becomes the job number one, mission critical vigilance, if you like. And if you look at the cyberspace to start off with, which you introduced, you've got attacks like, you know, WannaCry and Crack, Sunburst, the recent pipeline issues. You know, these are highlighting the fact that there are actors out there that want to attack our networks. And in the LTE space, it's not just an inconvenience of your PC being down. In the utility space, a successful hack can do a lot more, including taking you know, sizable chunks of infrastructure out. And so we need to think very carefully about security, but it's not just about features within products. And as AJ has mentioned, you know, VPNs are important, IPsec. A lot of the options from the IT world are now essentially being forced on the operational staff to have, you know, good encryption in products, to have authentication, etc., built in. It's not so much about that. It's actually about policy. And you've got organizations like NIST and NERC who are putting out standards for the electricity industry that emphasize procedures. And let me just give you a real simple example here. It's a non-technical procedure. If your fence is cut on a substation and some copper stolen, you would normally treat that as copper theft, okay? But how do you know that it wasn't just a cover for a more insidious attack where the bad guys broke in and they hacked into your IT network components at the substation and they stole the copper to kind of cover it up. So what NERC has done is set standards for utilities to say, if you get something like a breach of the fence, an attack like that, you don't just take the obvious measures and say, well, that must have been a copper theft. You actually look more deeply into the potential IT and cyber implications. So that's what I mean by policy. It's very important to understand what to do. It's important to understand what devices are on your network, because some of these networks are quite large and it's difficult to inventory all the devices in the network. That's an important step, and indeed products that are in the network can help with inventory. Some of the devices we're talking about today have got, for example, GPS built in, so you can ask the device, where actually are you, and the device using GPS can report back its location, and that helps a lot with building inventories and knowing what IT devices you have within your network. And secure boot's important. We certainly don't want hackers trying to run software on products that shouldn't be run. We have seen supply chain tampering. The recent attack, one of the recent attacks involved supply chain tampering, where malicious code was introduced into a legitimate product, and this then affected the operation of networks. And having secure boot can help to some extent with preventing that sort of thing. And then we also want to protect against tampering with hardware. So a lot of today's hardware, certainly the more advanced hardware, has got an anti-tamper option, which can detect the physical movement on the device. It can detect if the box is opened up and someone tries to get inside to make some unauthorized adjustment. And the more advanced anti-tamper stuff is actually quite sophisticated. It can detect both electrical probing and also movement using accelerometers to detect movement of the device. So yeah, there's a lot in the cyber security and general resilience area. We want a network that will stand up and not allow the lights to go out. And we also want the resilience that should the worst happen and the lights do go out, that these devices will be able to help us bring the network back up. And that's one of the reasons, just harking back to your early point, and I just want to amplify this.
Sure.
This is one of the reasons why utilities want a private network, because if the power goes down and the public cellular carrier goes down, you don't want to be relying on the public carrier to bring your network back up again.
You know, John, that again was just, it was a story, and there was a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I see Jitender and AJ nodding. I just can't help myself. But I think this discussion, that it doesn't stop. It's a continuous dialogue. It's not, I bought something, I'm good for 3 years, and if it breaks, then I'll replace it. Cyber and physical security, cyber physical systems, CPS. You mentioned NERC. You mentioned, if you will, let me pull out my little notes here. There are so many actors and so many components of our power grid and our industrial control systems, folks. The independent system operators, the regional transmission organizations, of course, NERC and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, state regulatory agencies, utilities. These groups all are part of the ecosystem. And again, I'm going to shout out to the active ecosystem program of Anterix. To what you're hearing today is the kind of discussion that needs to happen so that public safety and life is protected. We saw what happened in ERCOT, people freezing to death. To death. We saw what happened in PG&E and the wildfires. We saw Superstorm Sandy. I mean, these are disasters that we can learn from versus get caught up on, you know, why didn't we fix it? Well, this is what John and the team are here talking about. We have to be continuously improving. Jitender, why don't you offer, and then AJ, some comments, since John laid it out so well, how this is impacting your world of helping companies think about assets and the identification of and making sure they're using products that are both flexible and sustainable.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Pete. I just wanted to close first on the security aspect from a module perspective, right? So it's kind of funny. I mentioned at the beginning of the session that, you know, we're a half Italian company, but more importantly, when it comes to security, the other half of us is Israeli, right? Security is in our DNA. With IoT scaling, we know the importance of security, as we just talked about. And that's why we're investing a lot as a company to ensure the maximum level of security in all of our processes, right? So we're including security at the time of manufacturing. We're including security in terms of encryption, the communication channel over the air with the state-of-the-art protocols, and or even security within the device itself, such as assigning specific firmware that must be loaded on the device so we can prevent any malicious software. Those are some of the examples of things that we're doing in a high level just to kind of show the importance of security. But also, what else are we doing in terms of to meet the needs of the utilities, right? So we started, as I mentioned, to introduce new modules to meet the specific requirements for utilities that are doing infrastructure upgrades. We've decided not to offer older products due to the projected lifespan, right? That's quite important to understand. We're not just taking something that's been around for a few years. This is brand new products because we understand utilities want 10 plus years of longevity, right? 15 years, maybe even 20 years. We're also supporting the new Anterix Band 8 spectrum to enable private LTE deployments in NB-IoT, in Cat-M, in Cat-1, and Cat-4. So our modules are evolving towards the latest 3GPP standards for IoT, and we're also enabling connectivity inside of our module with a SIM on the private network, right? So our modules are able to also get onto the MNO network if you want to start off that way or if you want to fall back that way. We're also including device management capabilities. So anyways, these are a few of the things that we're doing specifically for the new Anterix spectrum and the networks that are being deployed, just to kind of make sure our critical infrastructure has the latest and greatest stuff that so we protect what we really care about.
Yeah. Before we jump to AJ, you right now have the gold star for acronyms and the articulation of, so shout out to you. But anybody who's listening who knows, those are very important factoids. And I would hope that when you're purchasing and you have a gentleman like Jitender marketing to you, he's helping you think about what you may not know about. And I always call that the known or the unknown unknowns when looking at a modernization or transformation, and whether that's private LTE or a device, these are the things we need to be thinking about, folks. So Jitender, thank you. AJ, can you jump in on this discussion about architecture and continuously looking at making a network secure and that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been involved in one of the largest deployments of devices on a private LTE network. So we have like 30,000 cellular routers deployed, operating on Southern Links private LTE band 26 network, which is used by Southern Company to connect their distribution automation assets. And we've learned, obviously, over the years, John was right. We have all these features in the devices, but the NERC CEP, those are policies. So the features have to enable a particular outcome, which is, first of all, when the devices are provisioned, the device's configuration is complex, so the whole provisioning has to be automated. So the field technicians or the folks who are preparing these devices for deployment in the fields can go about configuring the device with all the security settings that are going to be necessary for the device to operate in the field. The device has to generate an audit log for any changes somebody has made to the device. It may have to generate an alarm, if somebody opens the door or somebody moves the device, through the temper detection or movement. Device is just one part, managing the deployment, the rollout of devices, scaling them from like 0 to, thousands of devices. I mean, that takes experience, and that requires, having devices talk to multiple different systems and integrate well together. And that's where, the standards come in, as we talked at the onset of the call, standards both in terms of the device being able to talk to the network, and then all the other layers in the communication stack being able to talk to the corresponding, peers, be it in the data center or beyond. And our experience has been that this all can be done. This can be done in a secure fashion, but having a right architecture, upfront is very important. And one point I would like to make is, specifically for utility applications, like John mentioned at the onset, much of the action in utility space has been happening in the distribution automation, which is applications like fault location, isolation service restoration, where utilities are monitoring reclosers for isolating faults, and restoring service or the power factor regulation. All these applications require a certain level of quality of service. While they don't require latencies and low milliseconds, but they still need a reasonable latency. And LTE as a technology, certainly helps in that regard. And having a system which is also able to provide a redundancy so that not any one system goes down or one element in the network goes down, the whole network is down. So you need to incorporate some of those elements into your network design upfront.
Yes, and I'll tell you, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, since it's been brought up, this idea of baking security in versus bolting it on is a phrase that we heard a lot when cybersecurity and the FISMA legislation came out years ago in our country. But the cybersecurity framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity is not a bad read, folks. It helps you think about, as an organization, what's the type of risk profile, in so many words, I am, or that one for an organization. And then from there, I think you can say, wow, this is what I'm willing to accept, and then and I can maybe go out and buy some product to support that risk posture. Now, then there's developing cyber resilient systems, which is NIST 800-160 version 2. These are documents that speak to, hey, if I'm going to build something and I'm working with a partner like any one of these gentlemen here, or an Anterix or some other community, what are the things we need to be thinking about? So I wanted to mention those two references. John, let me come back to you, because the cyber and the security discussion sometimes either puts people to sleep or says, I'm glad somebody's dealing with that and the privacy of data. But there's also I call it, we have to mitigate risk, and we have to be compliant. We have to have standards and certs, but there's also this art of the possible and the opportunity that, say, private LTE presents. And you mentioned earlier about it allows for control, and maybe a carrier network isn't who you want to have to rely on if something. But talk a little bit about some of that excitement that comes with private LTE and the innovations happening in your industry.
Well, there are certainly things that can be done with private LTE that were not possible with the traditional solution. And for those in the audience that are not familiar with traditional utility communications, companies like GE and 4RF have provided radio-based, radio-based solutions for quite some time, and LTE is still relatively new. So those radio-based solutions did allow for power factor control and for grid restoration activities, but they didn't allow for any of the new initiatives that we're seeing now in the public safety and electric utility area. Utilities today are quite mobile. If you look at the problems involved in restoration after a cyclone or other adverse weather event, it's about getting trucks and guys out there, guys and gals I should say, out there to do the restoration work. So utilities today are mobile. They need systems that will operate in vehicles, and private LTE provides the ability to connect those vehicles together. So we're seeing exciting applications in terms of job dispatch, mapping, GIS technology to allow the field force to locate vulnerable electrical points within the network and intend to service jobs that are coming out for those. And so now we're seeing LTE enabling in-vehicle data communications. And again, in a disaster event, a private LTE network can be built with that kind of resilience in mind. And we need to extend that resilience to the vehicle. So the LTE device that's in the vehicle needs to have adequate protection to operate. And the vehicle environment is not that easy to work in. The Society for Automotive Engineering have got various standards that set out operation to work with 12-volt private vehicle and 24-volt truck vehicle systems. The International Standards Organization has standards for electrical and vibration resilience within products. And so today, LTE devices in the utility network are going into vehicles, and they need to meet these kinds of standards to offer modern day workforce mobility enhancement that is possible through LTE, that was not possible through the narrow band private radio systems that went before.
Thank you. And I think that paints, I know that paints a picture of just technology. Look, we all, I think it was said earlier that technology is not the problem, or if it was inferred or it was meant to be stated, that this is the beauty of the world is moving at such a clip. We're digitally connected ubiquitously. There's a term, let me throw one out, IPv6, the next generation internet protocol that's going to allow for communications, but it's going to require a new architecture and ingestion of new tech. So this doesn't happen overnight, folks. It isn't plug and play when you start talking private LTE and devices. That you need a team of folks who know how to do it, and you're looking at 3 of them that comprise that knowledge, that body of knowledge. Jitendra, can you take that question too and speak to this promise of private LTE and the spectrum component, and leave some folks with some, wow, I want to learn more about that moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things I see is as we talk to more private customers, I mean, right now it's really I think we're in a good situation because our wide portfolio, right? Right now we're starting with, Cat M, NB, Cat 1, Cat 4, but eventually down the line, they're going to want more, all the way up to 5G. And I think we have a lot of experience in that, especially from the carrier side and the consumer side, that we can bring here. And so that's one big space that we're seeing things in. And basically all the experience that we have with the MNO, where they want to be able to start off, like right now, until private networks get built out, a lot of the customers, a lot of the utilities are going to be starting off on an MNO. And then, whenever private comes, they may or may not want to fall back onto the private network. So I think those are 2 areas that we see a lot of promise, and that we can get things started sooner as opposed to later, because by the time they build out the private network across the country, it's going to take a lot of time.
Thank you. AJ.
Yeah, so, LTE as a technology, I think, has had a phenomenal success in proving that, you can converge multiple applications onto a single fabric, whether it's just data as well as voice. I think that whole convergence of multiple applications, which includes voice, is certainly a big draw. And then, of course, being standards-based, utilities have more options in terms of interoperable devices to choose from. So, certainly that opens up the possibilities. And there are, other subtle things about owning your own network, aside from the ability to service it at a priority than what the commercial networks might be able to do. I mean, one example is that we have seen in the field is, a lot of these public networks, so LTE as a technology has a feature called discontinuous reception. That feature is enabled and allows the smartphones to kind of sleep for a few tens of milliseconds, in the connected state, and that helps save the battery life. However, it adds some jitter and latency, and some of the SCADA applications may not tolerate that. So if you have a private LTE network, you can create your own QoS profile. You can disable some of these features, which might be beneficial for public networks, but may not be required and may get in the way for private LTE, for operation of your devices. Now, I don't want to say, the public commercial networks, I think they have been doing a great job also trying to service the utility industry, and they certainly have the capability to do that. And, I'm sure they are also thinking about making their networks, more configurable or suitable for utility applications as well. But if you have a private LTE network, the knobs are yours to control.
Man.
Pete, I just want to add one thing, if I may.
Sure.
Just with the whole private network, one of the advantages, for example, like an Antrix that has a US Band 8 network, is because it's a purely private network, they don't have any liability like an AT&T or a Verizon or other MNO who continuously need to keep on migrating to new technologies while refarming their bands, right? So once someone deploys the Antrix network for utilities, it could last for a very long time. And I say that because that's one of the most important things, is the life cycle. So that from a private network, this is one of the advantages from a network perspective.
John, do you have a comment? Because I have another question for the group, and then we're going to head towards parting shots. Do you have any comments on that?
Sure, it's a good point. You know, most utility networks will, during the build out of a private network, need to rely on public carriers. And in fact, a prudent utility operator will almost certainly have a backup for their private network that utilizes a public utility. And so one of the features that is important in LTE devices for this kind of application is dual SIM. So you have two SIM cards. One SIM card might be on a public carrier, which is your fallback, and one SIM card will be on your private network, which is your principal operating medium. And the mechanism to fail over between either the public cellular failure or a private LTE network failure provides a high degree of confidence that you're going to be able to operate the network. And the second advantage of the dual SIM arrangement is that you may be deploying terminals in the field in advance of the core LTE network rollout, your own private core LTE network rollout. And so in the initial stages, those remote devices can provide or pick up service from the public carrier and then be served by the private LTE infrastructure once it's rolled out.
Yeah, I thank you. And I'm going to come down to Jitender on this next question, because I feel like in the discussion today, we've, you know, the themes, again, just to remind folks, were obviously the importance of certs and standards. I mean, significantly important. We're hoping to secure communications both today, tomorrow, and continue to work on that. I think we touched on deployment and integration is not easy. It takes not one, but sometimes a village of really smart people. And I can keep saying, I'm looking at 3 of them right now, not including me. I think I'm okay when it comes to this stuff, but I would hire you 3 in a second, or a New York minute, as they say. But evolving capabilities is something that I think we also have hit on today. So in my final question to the group before we do our parting shots, which is what do you take away from this and leave with the audience? I can't help but think, if I was a grid operator or a grid C-level, you know, our grid is an engineering marvel, as I always like to say. It's over 100 years old. It's what powers our lives. We need it, from drinking clean water to breathing clean air to driving a safe vehicle. And we hear autonomous vehicles, and we hear flying cars, and we hear about unmanned aerial vehicles, and the different flavors and tastes of water. I mean, it's all dependent upon safety, to John and your point at the beginning, and making sure we're as safe and secure as we can. So my question is, you know, there are late adopters in this discussion. There are utility folks saying, not in my backyard. What are you feeling? Are you sensing there's a shift in that because of the things that we're seeing happening in our world? What is it that you would like to say to a utility operator about, hey, we're not here to rip and replace, we're here to create a more robust complementary infrastructure for you and your customers? What would you say, and what are you hearing from that utility community, Jitender?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, I mean, the time is right. Private networks have been around for a while, even in the utility space, like I mentioned, in Europe, right? So it's been there for 5-6 years with 450 megahertz. So there's been a lot of things we've learned. We're coming out with brand new products geared towards the utilities that are hardened and robust, and et cetera. So I think it's time, you know, it's going to take a little time to roll it out. But I think you're starting to see the initial set of products coming out from an infrastructure side, from a device perspective, from a module perspective. So I think, you know, I think it's time to start doing POCs and trials, and, you know, jumping in the pool to a certain extent.
Yeah, trials, use cases, leveraging, and again, this ecosystem you're a part of. I think that's equally as important as when you're talking to companies about your products. We need ambassadors and we need evangelists, and I think obviously I think the 3 of you do it incredibly well. Just based on
right now, Antrix is starting off small, right? They're focusing on a certain segment, you know, like I said, like in LPWA and Cat 1 and Cat 4. You know, eventually they're going to broaden it out. So right now, I think that's what we want to focus in on, and prove it, and then expand beyond this in time.
Thank you. AJ, your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I think this whole narrative that utilities have been slow, I don't think it's right. I like to think, you know, they are like safe and cautious. They want to make sure the technology is mature. There is wide ecosystem around devices and infrastructure, and the technology has been proven in the field. And I think that is the case now for LTE. You know, as a group within GE, we have worked with module vendors like Telit and others to integrate modules and make devices available to the end customers. We also have line of communication with chipset suppliers like Qualcomm, where we are able to add our voice to the needs of utilities, so that the chipsets can become available for Telit to use and make modules with long duration lifespans that we can then incorporate into our devices. So there is certainly momentum behind this technology. Again, utility needs sometimes are different, and sometimes not a single technology is going to solve all their needs. I mean, there might be areas where it may not be economically feasible to roll another cell site. In that cases, having a hybrid solution which can incorporate both a cellular radio and a proprietary radio to extend the network, to few devices in a more cost-effective manner, I think would be helpful. So, I think overall, John mentioned another key thing about dual SIM, being able to transition from a public network to a private network over time as the utility is building out a network, I think is critical. The use of eSIM, where those profiles can be pushed out over the air, I think that's another development that is happening in the industry that's going to be quite useful for utility industry as a whole. So pretty excited about the future.
Before I move to John for that question, you triggered a thought. I promised that I would do this, and I am right now. There are utilities with lots of money and lots of opportunity to test, try out. What do you say to those that don't have the finances to make that investment, but are part of this tapestry? I mean, do you run into that where we can't afford to upgrade? We can't afford. What do you say to those smaller utilities that are, suffering from that matter?
Yeah, so I think given the one of the key things to drive down the cost in terms of equipment is to create a broader ecosystem. I think that has happened in the devices, as exhibited by this panel. Certainly on the infrastructure side, there is a lot more players in the base station and the core network, who want to tailor their solution for utility needs. So the story is much more brighter than probably it was, a few years ago. One of the biggest Achilles heel of utilities being able to deploy this LTE was availability of spectrum, or rather lack of availability of spectrum. And I think with Anterix, making this allocation available, I think that certainly paves the way. And then, CBRS spectrum, which is, although a mid-band spectrum, but certainly, provides another option for utilities, to add more capacity tier to their networks. So what we would say is, certainly some of the utilities who may want to start small, I mean, they can certainly start small. They don't have to deploy a very large network, right? They can have a single cell site, which they can set up in a cost-effective manner, and a few devices that are able to support, both the narrowband technology and the LTE technology in the same box, which makes their transition easier as they increase their LTE footprint.
AJ, that was awesome. I mean, I'm going to use some of that too when I convey it, because it's like dipping your toe and slow and steady wins the race should resonate with those that don't have, as you mentioned, a lot of the resources to do this overnight. John, your thoughts on that from that utility perspective? What are they hearing? What would resonate?
Well, one of the things that it's important to understand is that the utility space may well seem as if it's a pot of gold, but it's actually much more complex than that, because most states have a Public Utilities Commission, and utilities must set out their planned spend over the next period of time, and the Utilities Commission will then regulate their prices in such a way that the profits are not excessive and they can achieve the various capital expansion programs that they want to do. So spending cycles can be extended, and it's not possible always for a utility to just rush out and buy the latest technology. And as Jitendra mentioned earlier, some of the systems have to, of necessity, last quite some time. The second point I'd like to make is we've spent a lot of time speaking today about electric utilities, and of course that's the sort of sexy area with the smart grid and those sorts of things. But another very important utility for all of us is the water, the drinking water, and the wastewater utility operators. And when talking to people about this, one of the points that those utilities make, and I think it's a very fair point, is look, you can survive without electricity for one day. I mean, it's a real inconvenience, and it'll make national news and all the rest of it. But we can survive that. But you try to last one day without sanitation and without drinking water, and you find just how bad life can be. So the water utilities, some of them have quite old infrastructure, and one of the incentives for them to upgrade to something like LTE, or indeed perhaps new private radio equipment, is the fact that the traditional public carriers, and I'm not talking about the cellular carriers, but the traditional public telephone carriers, are removing what's called private wire services. So in the old days, if you're a utility and you didn't want to have your own radio network, you would lease circuits from the public carrier, and they'd come to you through underground twisted pair cables, a little bit like telephone service cables. But that private wire service doesn't make money for the telephone carriers, and so they are pulling out from that private wire service. So there's quite an incentive now for utilities, water, as I've just mentioned, the electricity utilities we've been talking about today, and some of the others such as gas reticulation. These utilities have to move from services that were traditionally provided by public carriers over to their own private networks. And if they're only just dipping their toe into this area, LTE makes good sense because they can leverage the public cellular service, and they can also follow down the path of implementing their own private LTE network. As I said, there are still private radio solutions available. They don't offer the same sort of broadband capability that LTE has, but in many cases they'll do the job for basic control and monitoring tasks. But the one thing I will say, and I've been in this business now for more than 20 years, is that no matter what size IP pipe you put in place, next year you want more capacity.
Yes.
The moment you give people capacity, and even if you call it broadband, next year they want more. And we've seen this with the public cellular networks going from GPRS through 3G, 4G, and now 5G. And in the utility space, that uptake is much slower. Some utility networks still relying on GPRS, but public cellular support for GPRS is going, and so they'll have to migrate, and LTE is where it's at today. 5G is on the horizon, but let's be a little realistic about 5G. That there's a lot of misunderstanding about 5G. You can run 5G services on mid-band and indeed even low-band spectrum, but most of the 5G hoopla is all about the millimeter wave spectrum where super high capacity is available, and that's not something that's going to serve utilities very well. Most utilities, the sweet spot for them is 4G LTE, and that's where the Anterix Band 8 spectrum really delivers. It's that space for realistically sized broadband applications that will do all of the basic monitoring and control that utilities require, as well as addressing the new applications such as workforce mobility that I touched on earlier.
John, I hope you have a parting shot, because that was one heck of a thing to think about if I was walking away from this conversation. So you're going to be last on this, because I'll give you a little bit of time to think through what you can add to that. I want to make this one comment, though, because that was awesome. Folks, have a plan. There are clearly incentives. The conversation should be one about not you better or the sky is falling, but just look at the world and look at your environment and think about what is that art of the possible. And if you try to do it sometimes by yourself, it could be painstaking, and you will retreat into, I'm just going to keep things the way they are. But John brought up energy, water, and waste management. John, I'm going to have you on one of my upcoming platforms that address the nexus of those three, because you are 100% right. When things aren't being able, or we're not able to drink and breathe and eat, that's when mayhem sets in. So thank you for bringing that point home. Jitender and AJ and John, I'd love to finish out with the tweetable moment section, the parting shot. My ask is that you heard a lot, you said a lot. We have an audience that is being educated as we speak. What is it that you'd like to leave so that folks are inspired to go learn a bit more and obviously take ownership of some of this in terms of its impact on humanity?
First.
You have the floor, my friend, Jitender.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, I just want to say, I guess, kind of summarizing what we talked about. I hope you're all excited about why the industry keeps talking about IoT. This is very real. It's here. It's more secure. It's more resilient. It increases efficiency. The network is here. And as we talked about today, certified modules or devices are here. So I hope this discussion we had today makes it clear how important it is for you to be partnered with the quality partners you can trust as we are protecting our critical infrastructure. So Telit is at the forefront along with our ecosystem partners, and we're here to help guide you. We're investing heavily in this space, and we really care about this space. So if you have any questions, let us know.
Thank you. Well said. AJ, parting shot.
Yeah, so, AMDS has been in this business for quite some time. And really, when it comes to, new technology, I think the first step obviously is to evaluate the use case, understand your application requirements, what the requirements are in terms of the latency, the throughput, and then, you go out and actually try the technology, whether it's a lab environment or it's in the field, to ensure the technology is able to meet those requirements and, get the comfort level with the devices. And that really eases the process of, rolling out a large fleet of these devices and having, upfront architecture, which is secure by design from the onset, I think is critical. And, again, the ecosystem around LTE has developed. There are certainly a lot of options and vendors and others who are, able to guide, customers through this journey. And we have been operating out of Rochester, New York for decades now, and, will be for foreseeable future. And, we're really excited to, help utilities and, other customers, with this journey of theirs.
Thank you. Big fan of Rochester. I've been there, and I will be back. So thank you, AJ. Very, very, very inspirational. John, why don't you close us out here with your shot?
Okay, well, I think the key message really from today, from what the panelists have said, is that utilities of all different types are really able now to roll out a choice of different network types. So in the last 5 years, we've seen initiatives in making spectrum available. The Anterix Band 8 initiative is a really powerful one because it supports LTE. But in the last few years, there have been other initiatives to free up spectrum that have been taken advantage of about utilities. So there is a very much utility story here that some of the things that have held up private networks, some of those roadblocks are now gone, and spectrum is available, whether the interest is in private radio or in LTE. And it's important, I think, to consider the broad range, because there's not just one size that fits all applications. Different types of problem within the network will require a different type of solution. And whether it's water, bulk, electric supply transmission, or local electric supply distribution, or wastewater disposal, all of these different systems require different types of technology. But there's certainly no doubt that Anterix has enabled a really exciting future with this private LTE. We've touched on the technologies within the products. I haven't said too much about my company's products, but 4RF is very active in both the private radio space and the LTE space, and indeed we're now the second company to receive approval for operation in the Anterix band from Anterix and the FCC. But my parting shot, well, I like to say, or 4RF likes to say, if I'm more honest, that it's beautiful when families connect, and being able to assemble a range of products with a range of spectrum options to solve utility problems is really what makes my day.
John, that was wonderful. And I'm going to finish with, folks, this isn't an easy topic, but today I'll tell you what, I feel smarter, and I sense the passion. I know you all care. Your companies are phenomenal, some young, some been around, but each of you, you expressed to me, and I know the audience must have felt this, you answered questions, in other words, why you should care, why I should care, why does this matter to me? Tech, humanity, and culture, they're intertwined. So with that, I want to thank each of you. You're amazing, seriously amazing. I want to thank Anterix. I want to thank Anthony and Danielle behind the scenes for making it happen. We will continue this discussion. Look these gentlemen up on social media. May not find a bunch about them, but 4RF, tell it, and GE, you surely will. To each of you, thank you for your time and attention to this most important discussion and matter.